Okay, hello. Here we go. First lesson for you about the floppy disks is that everyone loves them. Dogs love them, cats love them, and of course, wilkies love them. I have thousands of them. I enjoy archiving them, preserving them. I think we don't think about how to preserve floppy disks enough and exactly how to do it, so I'd like to change that. But in the meantime, I'm going to share my love of the floppy disk and kind of how it works and what's interesting about it. First thing is, just like human beings, it comes with a variety of beautiful shapes and sizes. The 3.5-inch disc is probably what you mostly think of about a floppy disk, but it comes in a 5.25 inch. And of course, the big chunk himself, the 8-inch disc, a little bit big on my taste, I have no idea, but for the original disc was 8 inches. Just oh lordy common size if you ever seen one. So what's interesting about these, they all work the same way. They're all different sizes, but they all effectively are the same technology, which I think is really cool. History lesson here. This computer, just like me, is from 1987. It's $1,200, and it has no hard drive because that would be too expensive. Hard drive would require a card and the drive itself. You're talking another $1,000. And the thing is, it has and boasts 2 floppy drives instead. Now, they're both 5.25 inch. You put your software, you run it from one, you put a blank in the other to save it. And that was so common for a stretch of time that to this day, it is our visual metaphor for saving. That's our save icon for you, because that's literally all you would have to save on. So interesting. This save icon is from PowerPoint, and I probably stared at this thing for months at a time. I'm sick of it. And even though we had that era where floppy disks were basically the exclusive way we shared information, they became obsolete quite quickly. And it's pretty easy to see why. Doom came on 4 disks. Doom 2 came on 5. Windows 3.1 came on 6. Windows 95, 13. Office had the option of coming on 24 or even 30 floppy disks. And yet, all these disks versus one CD, who would win? The CD would win handily. 1.5 megabyte floppy disks here. A CD can hold over 500 of them. No contest. As soon as people had this, there is no more floppy disk. Goodbye. Speaking of being doomed, make sure you check out Phil and Kimmy's talks, by the way. Just want to plug them. Doom's been referenced a lot here, and I am so happy about it. So what's cool about floppy disks, of course, is how it actually stores data. So how do you get binary data onto your disk here? Well, the answer is simple. You use magnets. But how does that work? Well, first let's talk about the physical nature of a disk. Now, the 3.5-inch is a rigid disk. It's got a plastic shell, and it's still floppy because the inside, right, the flexible material here is a magnetic material. It flops around. And it's usually some sort of ferrous thing, like iron oxide, cobalt, barium, ferrite. Doesn't really matter, as long as it keeps a magnetic field, right? This is going to be subdivided into cylindrical regions called tracks, and each of those are going to be divided into sectors. The disk drive itself, it has a magnetic head, and its only responsibility mechanically is to seek to the right sector. And it does that by rotating the disk, of course, and selecting the track by a lateral motion with a little motor on it. That moves the magnetic head up and down. Now, the thing about that I want to appreciate is the sound that it makes. I think I could go to sleep listening to the sound of floppy disks, floppy drives, because they are just they have this mechanical sound which just never gets old. I miss it, honestly. All right, so digging down into this, we can see how we would represent the magnetic information. Basically, the disks are magnetic fields, and they're going to represent pockets of information by the change in polarity. So if we can represent this by a bunch of bar magnets lined up, when the polarity changes, that's a 1, and when it stays the same, that's a 0. You can imagine how this would work. You're holding a magnet in your hand. You close your eyes, and you're hovering over these magnets. And whenever you feel the attraction, repulsion, whenever that changes, that's going to be a 1 to you. And whenever you don't sense anything, that's a 0. And in the ideal world, this is enough. We have a byte of information, 8 bits. That's great. Except we live in this thing called reality, and it never likes us to have nice things, which is a shame, really. So there's a problem with this. And the problem is if I asked you to snap your fingers every second, and then I ask somebody else, you both do it a different way because you have a different internal understanding of how long a second is. That's true here. Writing a disk on one drive does not necessarily transfer to another very well. Basically, long stretches of zeros are a problem because if we're closing our eyes and hovering over them, we don't sense any change. And for a length of time, how many zeros, how many magnets underneath was that? 2, 3, 4, 5? It's not apparent. So how do we solve that? Well, the same way I would solve it if you and I were snapping our fingers and we wanted to synchronize. We keep some sort of clock, a metronome, a tapping foot, right? Something like some conductor here is in the background, making sure that we play the notes at the same time. So what we can do is very simple. We can make sure there's always a polarity change, some attraction repulsion change we can tell with our magnet, and we can have that exist at a regular rate. So we always sense it within the data. So we can take our data, 0010 is our data that we're encoding, and we'll insert a 1 in between by switching the polarity underneath. And now we basically can sense that beat, the tapping of our foot. Whenever we sense a delay, that's a 0 and a 1 otherwise. So we ensure there's at least one change of magnetism for every bit. This is called frequency modulation encoding. And the array-inch chonkers here, that's what they did. And that was pretty good. It's naive, but it works. If we look at the wave produced, we see a square wave here where every vertical line is a 1. That's the thing we can sense. What's our problem is the horizontal line. That gets too long, then we start to lose track of what it is. What's really, really fascinating to me is there's dozens of ways to do this. With the same exact technology here, there are dozens of ways to represent information. That's one, our tapping of the foot. Another thing we can think about is allowing our clock or our tapping of our foot to rest. Let it be a 0. Because the only thing we're really worried about is interrupting series of zeros. We can just insert a 1 in there with our clock bit whenever we sense a series of zeros. So if we have 2 zeros that are in our data, we put a 1 in between. Otherwise, we can have the clock be a 0. We don't have to tap our foot because the data is doing that for us. There's a note being played that we can synchronize on. And this simple change of just putting the 1 in between zeros, called modified FM encoding, it ensures that at most 1 polarity changes per bit. And we get this curve. This is the same exact data as before, but our curve is a lot smoother, right? There's a lot less vertical lines. The less, the better, honestly. So this is just a very simple change. And we can see the different waves here side by side. And we have, a simpler wave. Now, what you might be thinking is what improvement was actually made. We have the same amount of information here. It's the same data. It looks like we haven't really, maybe we were more clever, but we didn't actually solve a problem. It's easier if we look at the worst case, which is encoding all 1s in both. And with our tapping foot at the top, we have a very chaotic square wave here because we're basically changing polarity constantly. So we have this really, really rigid square wave here. It's very compact. In our modified encoding, though, we actually allow that 0 there. We can never have 2 1s in a row. So we never get that strict square wave. In fact, it's always our worst case. It's going to be just twice as efficient. And the thing about this is we have to change our brain a little bit. If we can handle the top square wave, but we never have it, what can we do? One of two things this enables. We can spin our disk twice as fast, or we can store twice as much stuff in the same space just from our simple change, which is why we call this single versus double density. I just find this really fascinating. It's a very cool change. It's bizarre to me that you can make that small little change in how it works and have drastic differences. You can fit twice as much stuff on this thing. That's really fascinating. And I want to end on visualization of the flux. So the flux visualization here. We're seeing the magnetic field across the entire disk. We're zooming out, and we see all 3 of these different OSs do different things on the floppy disk. They all have different strategies for how they store information. I find that fascinating. There's no best or worst thing here, but they all do it a different way. And it makes you think, right? If you can store the flux in different patterns like this, why can't you store it in a strategic way to paint whatever picture you want? Can I hide information on this? Absolutely. I can put a picture of this, my password here. I give you this floppy disk. It's not going to read on a normal machine. Hook it up to an oscilloscope, though, and you'll see this image. A little bit of stenography. Make sure you check out William's talk on stenography later on. And if you can do that, then you can put any image you want on it. I think the Bang Bang Con logo is a perfect opportunity to be used here. And now we have a little bit of art. I think this is great. Nothing is obsolete if you can make art out of it, right? Maybe that'll be true about me someday. But I think this is fascinating. I hope this inspires you to look at these old technologies a different way as well. If you make art with Ben's program here, thank you, Ben. Please send it to me. Please send me all your floppy disks. And basically, thank you for putting up with me. All right, floppy disks in chat. Thanks.